So let Stephen take it from here.
Awesome. Woo. Thank you so much, Michael, for having me out. It's funny, Michael and I, we've talked about governance for a long time, probably more than a year now, because oftentimes, 2 years now, oftentimes engineers, we often talk about the technology, we talk about how do we build, how do we look at processes on a small scale, but oftentimes teams aren't thinking about the systemic pieces of their policy and their people that they put into place across an organization in order to make these things effective. So really glad to be here talking about these sorts of things. So for those who don't know me, my name is Stephen Fluin. I lead developer relations for the Angular team. My role on the team really has two parts. First is to help developers be successful with Angular. And second, it's to reflect the needs of the community onto the team to make sure that we're listening so that we understand what it's like to be in the industry, to be building software every day, to be managing teams that build software, because we need to acknowledge that context and use that to inform all of our product decisions along the way. Another piece of information about me is I was actually in kind of enterprise consulting for around 15 years at a consultancy. So I've seen a lot of different companies build software in a lot of different ways. And I've seen how it's done in the real world. And then I've always heard about this Google thing. And I got there and I was like a noogler on my first day wearing my funny hat. And I was like, it can't be this good, right? Like they can't have figured out all these different problems. And I won't say that they've figured out everything, but there's a lot of processes that have been very intentionally selected to help drive scale, to help drive maintainability, to help drive value, not only for the team's internal, but for the customers, right? For the users that are using all of the different products across the company. So there's a couple disclaimers here. So I'm not claiming homogeneity across all of Google, right? Google is a large, large company now with lots of different teams, lots of different products. Some people do different things in different ways. But I do want to represent kind of what I've seen about Google from being within the Angular team. So my context is within a shared infrastructure team working on this web platform called Angular. Did we lose the mic? No, we're good, okay. So Angular, for those of you who don't know, is a platform for building technologies. So there's millions and millions of companies out there building web applications. And we think that millions of those companies are using Angular to build those web apps, right? So when you are KLM.com and you have to build a website that lets people book tickets, you might be using Angular. If you are a large bank, like Deutsche Bank, who has to have 40 different ways of customers signing up for an account, you might be using Angular. And so on the Angular team, we actually build this open source. So we do everything in the public on GitHub, trying to use the best of what we know from within Google. But then we also try and bring back the best of open source into the Google teams that we work with. Because Google is used extensively, or Angular is used extensively across Google. At this point, there's more than 1,500 projects across the organization that are using Angular. So a lot of success both internal to Google as well as external to Google. So the question that we had was, how does Google govern software? And I would really sum everything up in kind of 2 points: trust and automation. So as I go through things today, I'm going to come back to these 2 points in a lot of different places, because at some level you have to trust your people. And I think Google really, really leans on that. And we're going to see a lot of different instances of that. And then you also have to have really good automation, right? You have to have systems in place that help people make the right decisions, make these people that you trust able to actually execute on their plans and their ideas. One of the questions that we get about governance when we start talking about this with people is they think of governance as this idea of like a ban list, of like, how do we stop developers from doing all the bad things? And I want to make sure that we're not thinking about it that way, right? Governance shouldn't just be what you can't do. Governance should be a way of leading your organization and thinking about, okay, how do we set the model? How do we establish the systems and the processes that allow us to be effective and allow us to innovate and allow us to have the agility that we want as an organization? So let's not just block things. Let's actually empower all of our team members to be valuable and to be valued across the different organizations that we work with. So I'm going to go through this in a few different sections. So first I'm going to start off talking about people. Then I'm going to dive into some of the tools that we use. And then I'm going to end up talking a little bit about Angular and what we on the Angular team are trying to do to take some of these best practices and share them with the world. So let's start off talking about people. One of the things you're going to note about this presentation is in some ways it's just an excuse for me to show funny pictures from my life and from the Angular team. So please forgive me on that. And so the first picture I actually want to show is this. This is my son, Daniel. He's almost a year old now. And the reason I'm showing him is because a lot of enterprises actually treat all of their engineers like I have to treat Daniel. He's wandering around the house. He's walking now almost for the first time. And he wants to get into everything, right? He wants to do all the naughty things that I don't want him doing, that are not safe for him, that are not safe for the family. And a lot of companies treat their engineers like this, right? They're saying, hey, don't go and do that. Stop, don't do that, don't do this. And we really, at Google, we think about things very, very differently than that, right? We think of all of our engineers not as people that need to be kind of coddled and controlled, but people that need to be empowered and led. And so I think that that's a really, really important point in terms of how you can trust your people. And if you look at the trust model in Google, we actually have a very, very high degree of internal trust. So when you look at basically any engineer that works at Google, they can access almost all of the source code at Google, right? We have a single giant monorepository that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, and you can just search it. You can say, hey, what's going on in product X this week? And I can go look and I can see all the changes that are being made to it. I can see how they've implemented things. And I actually have a high degree of ability to impact change on the organization too, because I can go to any of those products that I can see. I can actually create a change and say, hey, Google Slides wasn't working well for me this morning. I wanted a new feature. I could go code up that button, write it, and submit that. Now, there's a lot of process, and we'll get into some of the steps that we take once you actually want to make a change like that and how we govern that. But this idea that anyone should be able to see and understand the code and then be able to actually drive change if they care about it means that most of the products at Google have people that care about them driving them, which is a really, really good place to be. And it is really, really beneficial that we trust our people. And oftentimes what we see is that our engineers are also our users, right? Because anytime you can have an overlap between the people that are building the software and the people that are using the software, you're going to end up more successfully driving good quality for your users. To contrast this high degree of trust that we have for internal engineers, we actually have a very low degree of external trust. So one of the things that we do at Google is we don't rely on any public code repositories for any of our builds. All of the open source code, all of the code that we have to license, buy, use at Google, we copy it in. And so by having a complete copy of the source code means we don't actually have to trust that someone else in their repository, in their build system, in their infrastructure are going to go and mess something up for me or introduce a security vulnerability or cause any sort of issues for me. So even though we don't technically own some of the source code, we're always trying to say, okay, how do we keep a copy of this code? How do we take ownership of it from the perspective of managing quality and safety and security and all those different things? So you can see how both of these things roll up into the Google mission overall, which is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And while this is our mission in terms of our products, we also see that we have to have the same sorts of ideas in terms of how do we govern and how do we allow and empower our engineers to be successful across the organization. Because if this mission is valuable for users and the public, it's probably also valuable for engineers so that they can go and learn from other people. They can go see what's going on in the company. And so we see this kind of manifested across the board. When it comes to really good people, hiring is a key piece to this. So Google, we get a ton of applications. A lot of people want to come work at Google. One of the things that we do to make sure that we are hiring the right people in the right way is we actually hire for roles. So we don't start with, hey, there's a job on team X, right? We start with, okay, what are the responsibilities and the skills needed to be a successful software engineer? And we start with that. And then, because when you look at hiring at scale, when you want to bring in lots of people and have them be successful over long periods of time across a number of different products, if you're hiring for a specific job and then that person, if that project is changed in some way and now they can't work on that project anymore, if they are not able to go work on a different project, if they're not able to apply those skill sets and that talent and that knowledge elsewhere, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure in a lot of different ways. Another thing that Google really focuses on is hiring leaders. So trying to find people that not only are just going to come in and do the work that they're given, but also say, hey, what can I do more? And so it was kind of funny. The first week I joined Google, I was having a meeting with my boss, and she said, I'm not your boss. Which it kind of epitomizes this idea that I'm not here, I'm not going to come in and tell you what to do every day. I'm going to come in here, we hired you because we trust you. We hired you because we want you to be successful, and we want you to bring yourself and your change and your ideas to the organization. And this is very, very hard for us from a lot of people in terms of governance standpoint, right? Again, we're thinking in that traditional org chart hierarchy of like, how do I make my managers do what they need to do to make every employee do what they need to do? But when you start flipping that mentality around, you start thinking about how do we empower our people and how do we make sure that we're only hiring people that we would actually trust at any level of the company affecting any of our products, it creates a different model where the governance then becomes into how do we make sure we hire great people, then how do we stop these great people from doing great things? I want to talk about a few cultural points that I think are key that are, I would say, I don't know if they were intentional, but they're definitely now explicitly identified as things that we see across different parts of the organization. And the first is ownership. So when I talk about ownership, every Googler should feel empowered to own the quality and own the user experience for issues across the company. So this is a picture of Jeremy on a skydiving little event that we did. And there's a funny story with Jeremy, because I went to him and I was complaining about a feature, right? In one of our Google Docs products, I was like, hey, this is dumb. Why does it work like this? And he said, well, did you go file the issue for that? Did you go let the team know? Did you go give them the feedback? And at that point, I hadn't. And it was kind of like, it is built and baked into our culture that you have to not only feel like, hey, this is a product, this is something someone other team built. No, but this is all from the same company. This is all from us. This is all from me. And so if I want to complain, I also have to be part of the solution. I have to say, hey, I'm going to give the team that feedback. I'm going to create the reproduction. I'm going to go file the issue, fill out all those reports. Because that's that level of ownership of saying, I'm actually responsible for the quality of all of our products, means that I'm going to not just complain, not just create these fragments and these segments within the company, but I'm going to own the entire kind of relationship that we have with our customers. There's a bit of a dark side to this, though, that you could think exists, which is, have you anyone heard of the diffusion of responsibility? The other name for this is bystander syndrome, where when something bad is happening and there's a lot of people around, everyone's like, someone should do something, and no one does. And I think we see this a lot in corporate culture, right, where something is wrong in the company, and I'm not going to do something. Someone should do it, though. Whose job is this? And so the way that I feel like Google sidesteps this a little bit is by saying, okay, it's your responsibility to initiate and push this a little bit forward, right? You're responsible to help. You cannot just sit idly by. You cannot stand and watch. But at the same time, you're not actually responsible for fixing them, right? You have to go track it down. You have to go put it on someone's radar. You have to go make sure that people are aware it's being prioritized, it's being considered, but you don't actually have to go and fix it. And so this idea of trying to have ownership of reporting and of communication and tracking without the responsibility of implementation means that when we rely on these systems, when we rely on these good people processes, we're going to at least understand our products, we're going to understand how customers use them, and hopefully we're going to be more successful from that. Another cultural piece that we have is really a drive towards transparency. This is again, the projector's a little bit dark in this room, so you probably can't see, and it's probably even worse on the video, but a culture of transparency. This is a picture of Igor de-aged to a child. And Igor, one of the things I love about Igor is he is always driving for transparency. So oftentimes there's this information asymmetry, especially in big companies, where a team that's building something or a team that is creating a shared library or a set of tools, they want to keep their roadmap secret. They want to keep everything internal, because when you externalize things, you get feedback, you get things that you're not prepared to deal with. But Igor, one of the best things about him is that he's always driving for transparency, because when you are open, when you are willing to listen and willing to grow and open your mindset to other teams' feedback, to customer feedback, you are ultimately always going to deliver a higher quality product. Because closing yourself off is not making you more effective. It's not driving better priorities. It's not driving more intention. It's actually just closing you off from value that you could be getting from your customers, from your partners. Another piece of another piece of culture is user centricity. This is again a picture of Vikram, who leads our tooling team with Daniel. I called Daniel a user here, but he's not quite yet. He uses our Google Home a little bit. But Vikram is a really great example of user centricity. We were making a plan and saying, hey, here's the next feature that we want to release in Angular. Right? Here's the next feature that our product team thinks is going to be value for all of our users. And he came back and asked the question like, hey, who are our users? How do we make sure that the set of users we're developing this feature for are the set of users we actually want in our product? And so this idea of respecting the users and respecting not only the ones that we have, the ones that we want, and bringing that into the conversation at every stage of our process is huge, and it's a really important cultural value to have and carry with you. How many people here have heard of yes and? So yes and is this idea that comes from improv, where when you're doing an improv sketch, you aren't ever supposed to reject something the other person says. And so if Jeff walks up to me and hands me an imaginary bottle of wine, I now have to take that bottle of wine and do something with it. I have to say, yes, here's a bottle of wine, and I'm going to go, and maybe I'm going to pour it out or do something like that. And this is actually really, really critical in enterprise environments, where oftentimes you end up with these silos, you end up with fiefdoms, and you want to reject everything that the other team is saying because it's going to take your resources, it's going to take all of your time, it's going to take your energy, it's going to pull you in the wrong direction. But if you take this kind of idea of starting with yes and saying, and we can do more and more, and when you have this high degree of trust and high degree of collaboration across teams, yes and can be a really, really empowering mindset shift, where by building this mindset into all of your teams, it really creates a cycle of collaboration where instead of figuring out why something doesn't work, you start the mindset of saying, how could we make this work? And if you combine that with these trusted teams, you're going to build great products. There is another concept that we have called N+1, or the idea that we need redundancy and resilience in systems. And this is actually something that elevates itself in the kind of the zeitgeist of Googlers into even the jokes that we tell. So there's often like lots of images floating around the company of, hey, not only does someone who embodies this spirit do things the simple way, they do things the hard way. So for example, if you were to make a piece of toast in this kind of N+1 mentality of redundancy and reliability, maybe you would have a plate up on the counter, and you'd also have a plate on the floor. So this is just a piece of culture that I think is so kind of magical. And then I'll talk about one more big piece of culture, which is not rolling your own crypto. This is a super specific, but this is something that we see all the time. Everyone at every company wants to be rolling their own libraries. They want to be creating their own tools when industry best practices exist. And the way that this manifests is someone goes and builds a thing. They only see their little narrow requirements, and it doesn't really solve the problem. It doesn't move the needle forward. And so this is really an essential piece to the culture. And so this is another example of people show these images all the time where like, hey, stop building these things yourself. Always go and have as a first step in terms of your culture, go look and see what else should I be using from the company. Has someone else solved this problem? Is someone else responsible for solving this problem? And this is really important because when you have that information asymmetry where I don't actually know what everyone else in the company is doing. And so, but if you build the culture and you create this idea that everyone has to start with looking for the solution instead of trying to build the solution, that is very, very valuable. One other piece that I think is really critical to creating companies that are effective and agile is actually all around bias and inclusion. I know that this gets talked a lot about at Google because what we end up seeing is if you don't focus on this, if you don't talk about it, you end up building teams, you end up building processes, products that don't serve your users. And so always asking the question of, does my team look like my user base? And if it doesn't, why not? Is there something that we're doing that's actually creating this hostile environment? Because one of the things that I really love to think about and I've loved to discover, because I didn't really understand this a long time ago, was that we all have biases, right? It is a natural, healthy process that your brain uses to create heuristics for how do we make decisions in everyday life in corporate culture. But what ends up happening is if you don't examine these biases, if you don't acknowledge the biases you have, you let them make decisions for you instead of making conscious data-driven decisions. And so there's a link here, bit.ly/implicit-test, which is one of my favorite websites because what it does is they have a list of bias tests where they say, hey, do you have bias against people with different sexuality? Do you have bias against people that have disabilities? Do you have bias against people of different weights? And by taking this test, what it does, it does associations, and it says, okay, do you have a stronger association between these two things or these two things? And they will actually tell you, it'll say, hey, you have a mild bias for this, or you don't have a bias, or you have a strong bias for this. And so taking these tests and acknowledging them isn't really a failure, right? If you have biases, that's okay. But the only way to get to success, the only way to do this is to acknowledge those biases and then turn those into from unconscious, implicit decisions into conscious decisions. And so as you're building organizations, as you're building teams, you actually have to acknowledge these things. This is part of governance, right? Your teams are not going to build the best software if they don't look like your customers. And so you should be asking the question as leaders, as people that are creating the foundation of the processes that you use, how are we including these ideas in that process? So we often see that shared infrastructure is one of the go-to solutions at basically every single company, right? You get to a certain scale. Now we're going to have one team that focuses just on the maybe one piece of infrastructure that everyone's going to use. One of the things that we do at Google, though, is generally shared infrastructure wins by great technology. It is not winning by fiat. So at Google, you are not told you have to go use technology X. Maybe if you're a new grad engineer, but even then there's room to question. But in general, all the shared infrastructure teams, they win only because they build great products that solve people's problems, and they create pull demand. They create teams that want to go and use their products. And what we feel is that this actually makes those shared infrastructure teams more successful. because they are only going to build things that people actually need, versus a shared infrastructure team where you've allowed to create, hey, this little fiefdom, there's this library, everyone has to use this library, and maybe it's no good. Maybe it's actually holding teams back. But the second half to that, to being successful in shared infrastructure, is that you have to partner with the teams. So again, I'm going to talk about tools a little bit later, but at Google, all of the shared infrastructure teams, they live in the same repository as their customers. Because at the end of the day, shared infrastructure has to evolve over time, and products and applications have to evolve over time. And if they're not doing that in lockstep, you're going to lose touch with each other. You're going to build a great new version of your shared infrastructure library, and no one's going to use it. And that is a problem of governance. We also see that shared infrastructure can end up at kind of multiple different tiers of the hierarchy. Obviously, I've shown 3 here, but there's a huge variance. But in general, the more broadly shared a piece of infrastructure is, the less specific it's going to be, right? So at Google, we have things like a team that focuses on web languages, right? So JavaScript and TypeScript. We have teams that are focused on other languages. These teams are not necessarily worrying about testing. They're not necessarily worrying about the other pieces, but they are connected to them, right? They're connected to the people that are worrying about those lower level concerns. Another piece that's really important to acknowledge and really internalize at the organizational level is this idea of defensive programming. So with Google, all of us moving together forward in lockstep is a lot of work, right? This is a non-zero effort in order to stay up to date with your dependencies, to stay up to date with a giant ecosystem of engineers that are moving forward. And one of the ways that we actually handle that is both automation, which I'll talk about, but dedicating some time. I mean, I know this sounds crazy, right? If there was a product manager hearing this, they're going to say an additional 10% based on on top of the features that I want to build. We can't afford that. That's ridiculous. But there's benefits to this too, right? By keeping up with your ecosystem, your product is going to stay more maintainable. Your product is going to stay more valuable. All right, now I want to move on to the tooling section. So now, let's assume you've got great people that have all these cultural manifestations, and you, by building the tools and processes and systems in place to create that culture, have enabled that. But now, we actually need some software. It's really funny because a lot of the conversations so far at this forum have been around agile, right? Agility and the Agile Manifesto. And so there's a really nice quote from one of the 4 points or 4 or 5 points of the Agile Manifesto: individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And what a lot of the software engineers out in the world did was they took this quote and they built tools to enforce this, it's a little bit of a contradiction, but at the same time, we need tools to be empowered to actually be successful. And so I think we all do the same thing. So at Google, we have what we call a monorepository. So all of the source code for most of our products are all in one place. So Gmail, AdSense, Cloud, Play, et cetera, et cetera. If you were going to go build a product at Google, you're probably going to end up putting it in the monorepository. Within the monorepository, we have a special folder called third party. So I mentioned how Google does not trust public NPM. We don't trust public repositories of code that can change, right? That are outside of our control. And so what we do is we copy all of the code from those tools that we've appropriately licensed, right? I mentioned this in one of the Q&As earlier, we have certain licenses that we say, these licenses are blessed. We are allowed to accept code under this license in this way. And then if you want to pull in a dependency into third party, you're actually empowered to do that. So this is actually the way that we get Angular into Google. So we build Angular on GitHub. We build it open source. Every commit is public. Every line of code is public. And then we synchronize that GitHub repository into Google so it can be used across all of the different products. One of the interesting things about Angular that we do is we actually sync every single commit. So every commit to master is basically in use at Google. And we use that validation from the monorepository to actually prove out every commit before we accept it. And so also in the third party is everything Linux, GCC, all of the dependencies all the way up and down the stack, right? We really try and make as few assumptions about code as possible. But this kind of creates a problem. I was hearing from one of the people at lunch who has several million lines of code, and their full rebuild and the full run of all their test suites took 90 days, was it? So between you making a one-line change in one of your products and knowing, did I ruin the world, it can be about 90 days. Obviously, you get some information earlier than that. But that would definitely not be acceptable if you were keeping all of the source code that you ever relied on in terms of every dependency in the same repository. And so what we do to solve that is we try and have a really good tool for building at scale. And so Minko's going to talk a lot about this, but it's a tool that we have externally actually as well called Bazel. And so what Bazel does is it focuses on this idea of being able to have incremental targets that can refer to each other, can depend on each other. And there's a second side effect here where we talked a lot about some of the tools that you can use to understand your dependencies and understand the relationships between projects. But oftentimes those tools were being created and entered and managed by humans. But within Bazel, the idea is that code is actually the source of truth. Right? We have these build.bazel files that, or bazel.build files, I always forget that it's one of the two. This one? OK. Build.bazel files, where the dependencies that you are relying on as an application, or the dependencies you're supplying as a library, have to and can only be included via one of these build configurations. And so we can actually use this, because we know this is the only way to add a dependency into my application. We can use this and we can do static analysis. We can make a very, very intelligent build tool that only rebuilds the things that we have to. And as I said, Minko's going to talk a lot about how Bazel is used at Google. We also have this thing called a one version policy. So we've got all the source code in one place. We've got all these third-party code. We made a rule that said that you can only have one version of any library in Google. And the side effect of this is that you don't end up having to make a choice, right? So there was a time in Google's history where they allowed multiple versions of, for example, a library like jQuery. And the side effect of that is every team needs a different version of jQuery, and they don't want to move to the latest version of jQuery because it includes breaking changes. And then you end up having 158 versions of jQuery. And this is really not acceptable, right? Because then every team does not get the benefits that the person that is updating jQuery is making. And so what we do is we have this one version policy that says there's one version of Angular, there's one version of dependency X, there's one version of dependency Y, so that if you are relying on that, you are always going to be on kind of the latest version. You're always going to be sharing the same version as everyone else. And there's a really great example of this that manifested a few years ago. How many people remember the Heartbleed SSL bug? So this was a really, really bad SSL bug that basically affected and broke the whole internet. Do we have water or anything? And so because Google has a one version policy, and because we have a monorepository, we basically had one version of OpenSSL at Google, which meant that you could patch that one version of OpenSSL, and the entire company got that benefit. All they had to do is rebuild and redeploy. So within a week, basically all of Google was patched. Whereas I've worked with companies who maybe they had 700 dependencies on OpenSSL. Thank you so much. And if you have 700 dependencies of OpenSSL, you will never get past that Heartbleed bug. You will always have that in your products, because no one has time to go back and fix all 700 products, right? Most code that we write is not living in terms of we're investing in it every day. Most code is something that's from the past. It's an abstraction that we kind of rely on today. And oftentimes we'll go back and we'll maintain it. But most code you don't touch every day. And that, I think, is by design. But if you can't trust that that code can be updated and is in lockstep with the rest of the ecosystem, that code is going to kind of rot and hurt you at some point. So the other thing that the only way that we could do any of this is with really, really good tests. So I mentioned that we do all these builds via Bazel. That is also how we run tests. So we have a really good policy at Google. If I break your test, so if I'm building Angular and I go and I break a project like Google Shopping Express, and I break their tests, I'm responsible. So as the person that broke someone else's tests, I'm responsible. So to get any code into Google, you have to have everyone else's tests working. The reason that this really incentivizes defensive programming and great automation is that if I don't break your tests, you're actually responsible, right? Because that was a bug in your project that you had not guaranteed that that would continue working. So for example, when we make an update to Angular, we're running over 70,000 test suites. So that's not 70,000 tests. That is 70,000 suites of tests across the entire company. So this is the really key part to automation, because the only way that lots and lots of engineers can collaborate effectively is by knowing that the change I made, we have fast builds, we have fast tests because of this incrementality, because of Bazel, and then knowing what I've actually broken and know where I've broken it so that I can go fix it. I can take responsibility. So I mentioned before that any engineer can go and propose modifications, right? I can go write code, I can change their code, I can say, I fixed that bug, I'm adding this feature. But we do have a set of governance steps to ensure that those features and those capabilities are actually good for the ecosystem. So I can make that change anytime, anywhere, so I can go anywhere in the code base, but it's all dependent on those tests. But there's a review process. So the first review process you need is you actually need 3 of these flags effectively on every change into the Google code base. The first is you have to have some other Googler look at your code. This is called an LGTM. And so what an LGTM does is it says, yeah, this makes sense, right? The person that's reviewing your code is not guaranteeing it works. They're not guaranteeing it matches exactly what is the best practice. They're not guaranteeing that it's perfect, but they're saying, yes, I have looked at this code and it's good. I think it is good to go. And this is a huge, huge thing because just having someone else responsible for saying, hey, I think this code looks good, means that you're going to dramatically increase your code quality. Because whenever engineers have to collaborate and you know that someone else is going to be reviewing your code, not only are they going to help you find the bugs, but you're probably going to fix more bugs yourself. Right? When you have the expectation that someone's reviewing your code, you're going to write better code. I don't remember the exact quote, but there's a joke online that says, like, write your code like the person that is reviewing it is like a psychopath and knows where you live. And it's that sort of mentality, right? Like where the better I write my code in the first place, it's going to find all of the bugs, it's going to find all the problems earlier in the process where it's cheaper to fix them. And so that's the first step. The second step is something we call readability. So within every language at Google, of the approved languages that we have, there are a set of people that know the standards, they know the best practices, they know how our style guide works, and they say, this is how we write C code, this is how we write JavaScript code. And they set those standards, and then they have this readability approval. And so whenever you submit a change, you actually have to get approval from someone that has readability. So if I'm writing JavaScript code and Python code, I need one person that has JavaScript readability and one person that has Python readability. And that could be the same person, could be different people. The third person in the review process is the owner. So within that giant monorepository, if you think about it as a giant folder structure, at any level within that folder structure, there can be what's called an owner's file. And what that owner's file says is, these are the people that are responsible for this part of the tree. So if I wanted to go and make a change to Gmail, I could make that change, I could submit it, I could pass all the tests, I could get a looks good to me, I could get a readability approval, but someone on the Gmail team who is established as an owner still has to say, yes, this change is intentionally good for our product. And I mean, they're highly incentivized to say yes if the change is actually good and in line with their vision, and they're incentivized to help me change how I approach things if it's maybe not perfectly aligned. So let's look at one of the ways that this manifests itself, especially when it comes to third-party code. In general, you've got a third-party set of owners file, and we've got a policy for creating how you create a new third-party project, right? If I want to pull in a brand new dependency into Google, I have to go get approval on that from the owner's file for the third-party code. But now if I've brought Angular into my project, into the company, I'm actually responsible for maintaining that, right? I will be listed as the owner. I can't just say, hey, I need this, someone else be responsible for it. And so what this does is it tightly aligns the idea of, if you need to bring it in, great, go and do it, but now you have to be responsible for it. And what will happen is, over time, more and more people will have that same dependency, and then either you will continue to own that, and you can decide, hey, we'll just be the Angular team here, or you can say, hey, we have enough people at the company that need this, it's worth investing in a team that's dedicated to maintaining that individual piece of infrastructure. So you want something, great, bring it in, now you own it. What this does is this really tries to lower the amount of friction that we see for all the innovation that happens, right? By having these simple rules, by having the ability for anyone to go in and do it, but to do it in a careful, governed manner where we don't let kind of arbitrary changes in and we make sure that the entire code base is moving forward with a high degree of trust, it allows anyone to innovate, right? You can come up with a product idea or a feature idea and go and build it without having to ask for permission first. And this is really, really great. And what we do is we have the dual property of that innovation with the ability to keep things sane, right? We don't have people going out and building crazy things. And there's a lot of different ways that these things kind of manifest. And so I want to tell one more story about how the monorepository and Angular kind of work together. Because there was a time when we were working on this thing, AngularJS, which was the previous version of Angular, and we were doing all these syncs, so every change that we made to Angular, or every set of changes that we made to Angular, we were syncing into Google. And there was actually a day where we broke Google. What ended up happening was something like the Java documentation, or one Java documentation project that someone had, was rendered in AngularJS. And so instead of rendering it via dependency, right, they're rendering it via the AngularJS that's built into Google. And so when AngularJS was broken for a short period of time, that broke all of Java. So we couldn't even compile Java because they couldn't compile AngularJS, which it depended on. So this was a little bit of the dark side of the monorepository and all these things moving forward fast. But it really, if you look at the culture of the company and the tools and the way that we respond to this, is we took it as a learning opportunity, right? This is never an individual's fault, right? I think the mentality that society is moving towards is that we all need to build better systems and not worry so much about individuals and failures and things like that. Because we actually have this concept of blameless postmortems. So if you're writing up a failure, you're saying, hey, we did XYZ wrong. It is not that individual that did it wrong, right? It was that we allowed them to fail. We didn't have the automation. We didn't have the button for them to click that automated the deployment. We didn't have the tests that were necessary to prove these things out. And so what this does is actually drives improvements to those systems as we all continue moving forward together. And in a way, this actually allows us to celebrate those failures. There's actually a quarterly or so email of the things that Google's messed up. So if you're a Google engineer, you get an email that says, hey, this system broke on this day, right? And this is how we recovered, and this is what we did about it. And what this does is it really tries to generalize the failures and the types of catastrophes that happen at scale and in these sorts of enterprises so that we can all learn from them. One of the questions earlier was how we've got so much knowledge, we've got so much great wisdom across a company, but how do you share that knowledge so that it's actually useful for different people? And celebrating those failures and actually making them more publicly visible, even though they might be embarrassing for an individual. You take the individual out and you say, hey, this happened, and this is how you could develop systems to prevent that in the future. One of the things that we do is we have a set of approved languages, so it's not just kind of fully the Wild Wild West, and we have a process to add new languages, like we did this with TypeScript. So we actually went through a pilot. We showed that there was demand. We had a backup plan. What if we don't want to go forward with this? But we actually got TypeScript approved as a language through this process because we showed that, hey, there's value to the company. But one of the things that all of these tools do is they focus on this idea of a supported path. So if you have some piece of technology that for some business reason has to be in a different technology, has to rely on a library that nobody else needs or some other weird technology constraint, you can do that, but you're going kind of off the supported path. So then the expectation is very clearly set that by being off the supported path, you now have to be responsible for build infrastructure, for testing, all those sorts of additional things that end up happening. One of the great tools that we have within Google for accessing the modern repository is really great code search. So there's a web browser interface that I can go and I can actually browse all of the source code at Google. And we've actually now open sourced parts of this tool so that you can actually do this. So this is a public website for Bazel where you can go and search some of the Bazel source code. So Bazel's an open source project. You can go and search the source code. And one of the best things about this web-based interface that we've actually surfaced via this tool is that you can click on links. Right? One of the biggest problems I think GitHub is about to fix is this idea that source code, when it's being viewed, is kind of a lesser status than when it's on your IDE. And this is a really big problem with collaboration because even if I have access to your source code via some web interface or it's in a GitHub repository, going to that GitHub repository, cloning it, checking it out, pulling up my ID, that's all a lot of work to get that full, rich understanding of what's going on in the application. And so by moving a lot of those tools into web-based tools, you're lowering the friction for someone to go and actually take a look at the code and see how is something implemented. Or I can say, hey, you're building another linked list, go click on this one and see how you should be building a linked list, or go leverage this library. And you can go look and say, here's the source code, does that make sense for me? And so this is actually a place where Google's trying to externalize a lot of those internal best practices. And so Google Cloud actually has a product called Google Cloud Source Repositories, where they offer these sorts of search features and hosting features, even integrated with GitHub, I believe. I'm not on that team, so I don't know that product well, but I love this idea that you can take the governance and the accessibility that we have across code and actually externalize that, and other teams can use that. Another example of a tool where we do this with is called Kythe, K-Y-T-H-E. And so what we do with Kythe is we actually build, that's how we build all of these linkages, right? So I can run a process across a code base, either in real time as it's being committed or on a scheduled basis, and I can say, hey, let's go parse the HTML and update references to web components or to Angular components. And so one of the things the Angular team has done recently is we actually built a bunch of new Kythe capabilities for Angular applications by exposing new symbols in our compiler so that you could go and use those in your application. But again, this is an open source tool that anyone can go and use to build these sorts of language-based tools for managing software at scale. Another tool that we use a lot is this idea of inline warnings and reminders. So we're all humans, we all fail, and so how do we overcome that, right? You could make a button that says, hey, you have to go get your manager's approval before you can do this, but we would rather just make informed consent, right? We want you not to make a mistake because you don't know, we want you to make a mistake because you thought the wrong thing. And so throughout, like when you're actually browsing that third-party source code folder, you'll actually see that little notice at the top, and it'll say, hey, here's our third-party source code policy. Here's what you should know before you actually try and make a change here. And this tries to get the balance between allowing people to do things that they need to do to get their job done without imposing a bunch of process steps, but also giving them the information they need to make those sorts of decisions. So I really love this Simpsons meme. Keep out or enter. I'm a sign, not a cop. And we see this across Google, where there's a lot of recommendations, there's a lot of guidelines, but Googlers actually have a ton of authority and a ton of power to say, hey, I need to go and do something. I'm going to ignore the rules. I'm going to ignore the guidelines for a moment to achieve a goal. And obviously, there's a reconciliation of that, right? If I break all of Google, we're going to go have a postmortem. We're going to talk about, but it's not the individual's fault. It's like, how do we build processes and systems that are better for this? So there's actually a separation, though, because on one end of the world, you've got development, but there's this other thing that we end up doing as software teams is what I'm going to call launches or releases. And in general, these things are a little bit different because not a lot of source code goes live automatically in real time, but a lot of source code doesn't, right? A lot of times we have to do some sort of manual testing. There's some extra process. Maybe it's a marketing feature like, hey, we don't want to tell our customers about this until it's actually ready and we can explain it to them. And so we separate launches and development. In general, launches are going to be a little bit more restricted, right? They're owned by the teams. And what we do is we have teams actually responsible to go and get privacy, security, and a bunch of different sign-offs before they go and do a launch. And so again, this is kind of just enforced culturally because the expectation is if you did a launch and then one of these things failed, or if someone noticed, they'd say, hey, where was your kind of launch approval? So, but there's also an intrinsic motivation to go and get those approvals, because if you want support from the greater Google organization, this is how you get it. You file a launch and say, hey, I would like to launch this product. I have this new idea or this new feature. And what will happen is Google has assets and Google has resources and teams that are there to help you. Make sure that you are handling user data correctly, making sure that you are doing things in a secure way, making sure that you're respecting the privacy of your users. And so by asking for that support, which you're responsible to do, they're actually going to give it to you. So Google definitely moves fast. And this goes back to the idea of there's so many best practices, there's so many cool products, there's so many cool libraries out there. How do you keep up with all of that? And it's a little bit funny, but the first time you ever go visit a Google office and you use the restroom, you will see these little signs sitting in the toilet. So we have two publications. One is generally called Learning on the Loo, and one is called Testing on the Toilet, where we actually normalize and share best practices across the company in the toilet. So this idea is like, we want to normalize a lot of the things like, hey, how should we be doing tests? What should we be naming our methods without being restrictive? And so it's just information. It's one way. And it tries to take advantage of your downtime, so to say. And the idea is that anyone can kind of create these, and there's a publication, right? So they do it every couple weeks or whatever. And by doing this, you have another avenue to get a hold of people rather than just sending a company-wide email saying, new policy on file naming, right? That maybe I would miss. And then so you have to kind of do this over and over and over again over time. So this is one of my favorite kind of fun things about how we normalize and share information across Google. So the last section I want to go through here is really talking about open source and platforms, particularly around Angular, because I think a lot of these things have a lot of interplay, because the way that you govern your application and your systems and your products really comes back to your product strategy and your company strategy. And I think open source is a key piece of that, and I want to explain why. So before I joined Google back in my consulting days, there's a company that makes snowmobiles, ATVs called Polaris, and they were looking at their open source strategy because one of their biggest assets is they have these trail maps. So they've got kind of some of the best maps in the world of like where if I want to go on a 3-mile backcountry drive on my snowmobile or my ATV, they've got the maps for it, right? Like this is something that is very kind of domain specific, but it's very, very valuable for all of those customers of theirs. And one of the things that I was proposing to them was this idea of you should make that open source, because they were really, really worried about this trail data being used by other companies, and they wanted it like secured and private and protected. And what I said is, no, you should do the exact opposite. You should go and share that trail data with everyone, because by sharing that trail data and by opening up, making it a platform that other people can add data to, you're actually, no matter what happens, no matter how many competitors come out, no matter how many people are building maps of the same trails, how many other companies are doing this, you're always going to become the central focal point for that data, right? So by opening up your data, by making it more valuable, you're actually opening other people to add value back to you. And so I love this kind of mentality shift, because no matter what company you work at, even Google, there are more smart people outside of your company than inside of your company. And one of the unfortunate ways that this manifests is that Angular actually has a huge, giant community of people that are building software. We've got a set of experts, and we've got open source contributors. So a lot of the Angular work is done. I think it was more than 40% of Angular's commits are actually written by the public, like people that we don't have a relationship with. And so one of my biggest problems when it comes to our platform strategy is actually we end up going and hiring some of the best people. And I'm like, no, stop hiring our best people. They were doing great before we hired them. When it comes to governance, and a lot of companies are very, very wary of open source. And I want to acknowledge some things off the bat. Open source does cost more. People think, oh, other people are going to do all the work for me, and it's going to save me all this time and energy and money. That is not the case. To have a successful open source product, it will cost you more. You have to invest. You have to invest in the community. You have to invest in education. You have to invest in collaboration. And these things are all you don't necessarily get them back one for one in terms of the community contributions. But what I will say is you will get a higher quality product when you open source. What will happen is someone out there is going to come to you with a PR. They're going to come to you with a problem. And you're going to solve that problem. But you didn't just solve that problem for that one person. They didn't just solve it for themselves. They actually solved it for the other 1,000 or the other 1,000,000 customers out there of yours that have that same need. And one of the things that we see in Google is we've actually, on the Angular team, solved a whole bunch of problems for the open source ecosystem for the enterprises that are using Angular before Google even needs those solutions, which is such a really, really interesting mentality. So before Google has to go and invest a bunch of features because some product needs this capability, we've probably already built it because we're trying to solve problems first for the community. And then obviously, open source if you invest correctly, you can get this giant ecosystem. So valuing the ecosystem, not just your internal code, not just your internal developers, but saying this thing is maybe bigger than us to our benefit. And we have to be good shepherds of that. We have to be giving back. And you have to give up some control in order to be successful there. So the last piece I want to just talk about is just the open source model of Angular. Because I've talked about all these cool tools, how we've got Bazel, we've got every single line of source code, blah, 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 building at scale, incrementality. And companies look at us and say, wow, I can't do any of that. How am I supposed to respond to this? And so one of the missions that the Angular team kind of has is to try and externalize a lot of these best practices that we have within Google. So for example, if you look in the Angular repo, so Angular org, Angular repo on GitHub, we actually have this model for what we believe teams and companies can use for their monorepository. So we have a set of tools, we can build it individually, we can test the whole thing, and it's all integrated, it's all moving forward in lockstep, right? Every change to the Angular repo, whether it's in our HTTP client or in Angular, is tested together and make sure it's going to keep working. And these are from different teams, right? These are different teams, these are different people who, without that integration, might not know the implications of their changes. There's a lot of other really great Google patterns that the team is trying to externalize. So Minko's going to talk a lot about Bazel. Hopefully I haven't talked about it too much. There's testability. So like Google's trying to bring, or the Angular team's trying to bring things like Protractor and WebDriver and this idea of we should start with tests, not end with them. Bringing accessibility. So how do we care about a lot of our users? Because oftentimes people think about accessibility when it comes to regulatory and compliance. But in general, you're missing out on customers and you're not serving your customers if you're not thinking about things like accessibility and internationalization. Hopefully that made sense about the third party. And we're also trying to get to this idea of, especially with Angular, where people don't say, oh, I'm an Angular 7 developer. We want there just to be one version of Angular that just keeps moving forward, is going to keep safely evolving and innovating with everyone kind of coming with us on this journey. So one of the ways that we're actually trying to double down on that idea that everyone can stay up to date on Angular is through integration testing. So we had an email set up a while ago called Community CI at Angular.io, where we actually wanted people to attach their projects to our latest commit to master and then send us their failures. This idea is if we just say, hey, let us know when we break you, because we can't do a full integration. I mean, we'd love to have your source code checked into our repository, but you probably don't want that, and we would have to talk about whether or not we want that. But at least we can have some linkages. We can have these systems talking to each other and sending us automated reports. But actually, Minko, who you're going to hear more from, has actually gone one step further. And so we're doing a lot of work on a new version of the Angular runtime called Ivy. And one of the things that Minko did is he actually went and built a GitHub repository where we checked in the top 100 libraries. We just found them on NPM. We found them on GitHub. And we checked in a project that uses those libraries so that we can just do a build of that library and see if everything's up to date. And so as you think about your customers, as you think about your users, is this an opportunity for you? Could you go and integrate with your customers more tightly instead of having everything in silos? Because I think in general, we really do want to help teams build with the best of the Google or build like the best of Google, because there's a lot of Google competitive value in the products that we build, but we're not trying to compete necessarily on the way that we build those tools, right? We think our open source strategy and making those tools better for everyone are ultimately going to benefit us as well. So we get a lot of questions. I don't know how much time I have about like, why does Google build Angular? Why does the Angular team build Google? I think I've addressed a couple about the open source. Happy to talk more about these. I'd love to get into the forum section of this. But really, the thing I want to leave everyone with is make sure that you're trying to empower your people, because a governance model that focuses on limiting is going to fundamentally be limiting for your company. But if you focus on empowering your people and engaging them and making them agile and not just the systems and processes and tools, you're going to be successful. And then the corollary to that you have to not leave behind is this idea of investing in automation. Because if you have the right people and the right tools, you can do anything. Thank you so much.